The haunted house on Maple Street. The old house on Maple Street had always been a source of fear for the people in the neighborhood. The dark, foreboding structure loomed over the street like a menacing giant, casting its shadow on the houses nearby. It had been abandoned for years, and rumors of its haunting had spread like wildfire among the locals. But despite the warnings and the fear it instilled, there were always those who were curious enough to explore its dark secrets. One such group was a group of teenagers who lived on the same street. They had grown up with stories of the haunted house, and the idea of exploring it had become something of a rite of passage for them. And so, one summer night, they gathered outside the house, nervously eyeing the dark windows and the overgrown lawn. "I don't know about this, guys," said Jessica, the youngest of the group. "Maybe we should just go home." "Ah, come on," said Ryan, the leader of the group. "Don't be such a scaredy cat. We're just going to take a quick look around and then leave. What's the worst that could happen?" As they approached the house, they could feel their hearts pounding in their chests. The front door was locked, but they found a window that had been left open. Ryan climbed through first, followed by the others. They shone their flashlights around the room, taking in the dust-covered furniture and the cobwebbed corners. "Okay, let's split up and search the place," said Ryan. "We'll meet back here in 10 minutes. The group dispersed, each taking a different part of the house. Jessica found herself in what appeared to be a child's bedroom. There were toys scattered around the room, and a faded poster of a cartoon character on the wall. But as she turned to leave, she heard a creaking noise behind her. She froze, her heart racing as she waited for the source of the sound to reveal itself. But there was nothing there, just the creaking of the old floorboards beneath her feet. She breathed a sigh of relief and made her way back to the main room. As the minutes ticked by, the group became increasingly nervous. There was something about the house that felt wrong, a sense of unease that they couldn't shake. And then, just as they were about to regroup, they heard a blood-curdling scream from upstairs. They all rushed to the stairs, their flashlights shaking in their hands. Ryan took the lead, bounding up the steps 2 at a time. When they reached the top, they saw a figure standing at the end of the hall, shrouded in darkness. "Who's there?" shouted Ryan. "Show yourself." But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and menacing. "Okay, we need to get out of here," said Ryan, his voice shaking. "Now." They turned to run back down the stairs, but suddenly the door at the end of the hall slammed shut, trapping them in the upper part of the house. They tried to open it, but it was locked tight. "Help!" shouted Jessica, pounding on the door with her fists. "We're trapped." And then they heard it. A low, guttural growling sound that seemed to come from the other side of the door. They froze, staring at each other in terror. "What is that?" whispered Sarah, one of the other girls in the group. But they didn't have time to ponder the question. The door suddenly burst open, and they saw a dark figure rushing towards them. The figure was humanoid in shape, but its features were twisted and distorted, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It let out a deafening roar as it charged towards the group. They scattered, trying to find a way to escape. Jessica ran towards a nearby window, hoping to climb out and reach safety. But as she approached it, she felt a cold hand grab her ankle, pulling her back. She screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the hand held tight. She looked down and saw a pale, ghostly face staring back at her, its eyes filled with malice and hunger. She tried to crawl away, but the figure dragged her back towards the center of the room. The others were too busy trying to fend off their own attackers to notice her plight. Just as Jessica thought she was done for, she saw a bright light shining through the windows. It was a police car, come to investigate the disturbance. The ghosts and ghouls in the room began to dissipate, their energy draining away as the light touched them. The cold hand that held Jessica's ankle turned to mist, and she scrambled to her feet. The police officers burst into the room, guns drawn. "What's going on here?" shouted one of them. "We were just exploring the house," said Ryan, trying to sound innocent. But the police officers weren't buying it. They took the teenagers outside and questioned them, taking down their names and addresses. As they were leaving, Jessica saw one of the officers whisper something to the others. "Looks like we've got some troublemakers in the neighborhood," he said. "Keep an eye on them." The group walked home in silence, shaken by what had happened. They had gone into the haunted house looking for a thrill, but they had found something much darker and more dangerous. As they reached their street, they saw that the police had cordoned off the haunted house, keeping anyone from entering. Jessica couldn't help but wonder what other secrets lay hidden inside those dark walls. Years later, when she was grown up and had children of her own, she would still feel a shiver run down her spine whenever she passed by the haunted house on Maple Street. She never forgot the terror she had felt inside, and the knowledge that there were things in this world that could not be explained or understood. But little did Jessica know that the events of that night would come back to haunt her in ways she never could have imagined. One day, years after their ill-fated trip to the haunted house, Jessica received a strange package in the mail. It was a small, unmarked box, wrapped in black paper. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should open it. But her curiosity got the better of her, and she tore off the wrapping. Inside the box, she found a single item, a small, carved wooden doll, with a sinister expression and eyes that seemed to follow her as she moved. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen this doll before, in the haunted house on Maple Street. As the days passed, strange things began to happen in Jessica's house. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut, and she would hear whispers and footsteps in empty rooms. She tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, that she was just being paranoid. But deep down, she knew that something was terribly wrong. One night, as she was lying in bed, she heard a creaking sound coming from the hallway. She got up to investigate, but as soon as she stepped out of her room, the door slammed shut behind her. She tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. And then she heard the whispering again. It was a voice she recognized, but couldn't place. "Jessica," it said. "You shouldn't have taken that doll. It belongs to us." Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Jessica saw a dark figure standing before her. It was the same twisted, ghostly figure she had seen in the haunted house all those years ago. "Who are you?" she whispered. The figure stepped closer, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "We are the spirits of the house on Maple Street," it said. "And we have come to claim what is ours." Jessica tried to back away, but the figure reached out and grabbed her by the arm, pulling her closer. And then, with a sudden burst of light, the figure was gone. Jessica found herself standing alone in the hallway, the doll clutched tightly in her hand. She knew then that she had to return the doll to its rightful place, in the haunted house on Maple Street. The next day, she made the journey back to the house, heart pounding in her chest. She approached the front door, and as she did, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She turned, and saw the ghostly figure standing behind her. "Thank you," it said, and then it was gone. Jessica pushed open the door and stepped inside. The house was just as she remembered it, dusty and abandoned. She made her way to the room where they had encountered the ghosts all those years ago. The room was empty, but she could feel the energy in the air, the presence of the spirits. She placed the doll on the floor, and stepped back. And then, with a sudden rush of wind and a blinding light, the ghosts were gone. Jessica breathed a sigh of relief, and turned to leave. But as she did, she heard a faint whisper in her ear. "We'll be watching you." She spun around, but there was no one there. And so, Jessica left the haunted house on Maple Street, knowing that she had come face to face with something beyond her understanding. Something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. As she walked away from the house, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She kept looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see the ghostly figures trailing behind her. But the streets were empty, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. She walked for what felt like hours, until she reached the safety of her own home. She locked the door behind her, and tried to forget about the horrors she had witnessed. But it was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the twisted faces of the ghosts, and heard their whispers in her ear. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Jessica tried to go about her life as usual, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then, one night, she woke up to find the carved wooden doll sitting on her nightstand, its eyes gleaming in the moonlight. Jessica screamed, and backed away from the doll. She knew then that the spirits of the haunted house on Maple Street were not done with her yet. She tried to dispose of the doll, but no matter where she put it, it always seemed to find its way back to her. And then, one night, as she was lying in bed, she heard a voice whispering her name. "Jessica," it said. "Come back to us." She sat up in bed, heart pounding. She knew then that she had to return to the haunted house on Maple Street, and face the ghosts once again. She got dressed, and made the journey back to the house, the doll clutched tightly in her hand. As she approached the front door, she felt a cold wind blowing, and heard the sound of whispers on the air. She pushed open the door, and stepped inside. The house was even more decrepit than she remembered, with cobwebs covering the walls and dust coating the floors. She made her way to the room where they had encountered the ghosts, and saw that the walls were covered in strange symbols and markings. As she stood there, the doll suddenly grew hot in her hand, and she felt a sudden surge of energy coursing through her body. And then, with a blinding flash of light, the ghosts appeared before her. They were even more twisted and malevolent than she remembered, with glowing eyes and outstretched hands. "You should never have come back," they hissed. Jessica tried to back away, but she was surrounded on all sides. The ghosts closed in, their hands grasping at her. And then, with a sudden burst of energy, Jessica raised the doll in her hand, and spoke the words she had heard echoing in her mind. The ghosts screamed, and then vanished in a burst of light. Jessica was left standing alone in the room, the doll clutched tightly in her hand. She knew then that the only way to break the curse was to destroy the doll once and for all. She made her way back to her own house, and gathered all the supplies she would need. And then, with a determined look in her eye, she lit a match and set the doll ablaze. As the flames consumed the wooden figure, Jessica felt a sudden sense of relief. She knew that the curse had been lifted, and that the ghosts of the haunted house on Maple Street were finally at peace. But as she turned to leave, she heard a faint whisper in her ear. "We'll always be watching you, Jessica."